Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Chester Arthur, and the focus is anything but the work. The year is 1883. Chester Arthur, of course, never wanted to be president of the United States, still felt he was not in his element at all, did not like all the difficult decisions he had to make, but there was one area that he actually did enjoy, and that was the social activities associated with being president. Now, this is where he was in his element, in part because it was a distraction from all those decisions he wanted to make. But nobody ever faulted Chester Arthur's social skills, his ability to throw a great party with being well-groomed, the perfect gentleman, all the best food, drinks, cigars. Well, the New York Tribune said that he is voted to be the handsomest president within the memory of this generation, and there is no limit to the praises of his appearance, his bearing, and his social qualities, which are heard on all sides. The New York Times commented that what we may call the official hospitality of President Arthur's administration is without a flaw. Now, that's not always the most important part of a presidential administration, but at least this was one area where Chester Arthur could take some pride. Take one day, February 1883, as just one example, where Chester Arthur, the President of the United States, went to the wedding of the daughter of James Blaine, the former Secretary of State. That same day in the afternoon, he went to the wedding of the daughter of Attorney General Benjamin Brewster. And not to be outdone, he held a reception that night for Army and Navy leaders that night at the White House. A very full day for the President of the United States, all primarily in social activities. The other thing Chester Arthur liked to do was to travel, to get out of Washington, D.C., and again away from those headaches. But this was increasingly difficult for Arthur because he was not a well man. His illnesses were persisting, and he finally got a diagnosis: Bright's disease. Now, Bright's disease was an umbrella term for many ailments associated with the kidneys. It was almost always fatal. And in this regard, Chester Arthur didn't want to worry other people, especially in the wake of his predecessor's assassination. The country had already gone through losing one president. They didn't need to fret about the health of another, and so Chester Arthur decided to suffer in silence. He did the best he could to keep his illness quiet. On one trip, though, he did have a flare-up. And this was a trip to Florida in April of 1883. There was tough travel on this one. It was kind of an exhausting trip. And toward the end, he was in his stateroom on the ship, the Tallapoosa, which was anchored in the harbor of Savannah, Georgia. He was staying for the night. And 2:30 in the morning, he awoke, crying in pain, called out for the ship's physician, Dr. Black, who came immediately. And Dr. Black was fearful for the president's life. Arthur confided in him about the diagnosis of Bright's disease, which actually made sense to Blake based on the symptoms he was suffering. He tried all manner of medicines to try to ease the pain and did not have a lot of luck. And word got out that the president was not only ill, perhaps he was dying. Well, that's what the press was saying, but Chester Arthur was going to have none of this. He got back to Washington, D.C. He denied it all. He said, much ado about nothing. I'm fine. He would try his very best to keep his illness secret, and by and large, he was successful. Now, there were some other trips for Arthur as well, kind of a mixed scenario. One trip to New York City, he went to dedicate the Brooklyn Bridge, kind of a big celebration. This is May of 1883. He was cheered throughout this event. There were big fireworks displayed that night that he participated in. So celebrations, yes, but he was exhausted. Took him a while to recover from this one. There was just too much for him given his illness. One thing he did not do on either this or any other trip to New York City throughout the rest of his presidency was to visit Julia Sand. He had that one visit with her. Her letters kept coming, but no more visits to Julia Sand, despite her constant urging. In fact, her letters took on a bit of a different tone after Arthur's one and only visit to her house, a little bit more about herself and her illness and frankly begging him to come visit, and it just frankly was not to be. And so finally she cut off her letters. Her final letter to Chester Arthur came on September 15th of 1883, in which Sand wrote, "My very bad friend, who does not deserve that I should care where he goes or what becomes of him. It is very hard for me to take hold of life again, and I am very grateful to those who help me at all to be cheerful. Do come if you can. but he never did. A few years later, Julia Sand was committed to an asylum where she spent the last 40 years of her life, not dying until 1933 at the age of 83. We don't know exactly the impact that these letters had on Chester Arthur and his presidency, but we do know this. He did visit Julia Sand, and he saved her letters. He burned all the rest of his correspondence, literally every piece of paper he could find, but not the Julia Sand letters. So it must have had some impact on him. How much? That we don't know. Now, one other trip for Chester Arthur, and this one was a really good one for him. It was away from everything. General Phil Sheridan, now the commanding general of the U.S. Army, pitched an idea to take the president and a small group out west to go to Yellowstone, this area that had become a national park under Ulysses Grant. Now, the farthest west Chester Arthur had ever been before was to Kansas, and that was about 25 years ago. Now he was heading off to Wyoming, and it was a glorious trip, in part because it was a small group, just a handful of travelers, about 10 people, no press. What did they do? They focused on fishing and camaraderie, the great outdoors. There were no signs of his illness, hanging out, palling around with the boys. This is what Chester Arthur loved to do. Likely, the most peaceful moments of his entire presidency came on this trip to Yellowstone. Well, Congress came back to work, and that meant work for Chester Arthur, and he couldn't avoid some of the topics crossing his desk. Now, one of the things he had advocated for in a previous annual message to Congress was a reduction in the tariff, and Congress stood up a commission to look into this, and they took it very seriously. They traveled the country, they gathered input, and made bold recommendations. Across the board, about a 25% cut in the tariff. More than most people thought, but it actually made sense because the Treasury was overflowing with the surplus. They didn't need the money, so let's bring that tax down. Well, Congress was not aligned with this because when they got their hands on the recommendation, they were pretty selfish in thinking that protection was good for their individual constituents. They liked the higher tariff, so they slowly chipped away at these recommendations. The final bill that went to Chester Arthur was only about a 2% decrease in the tariff. He signed it into law, but frankly, it was much ado about nothing. Now, another area where Arthur continued to push was in the modernization of the U.S. Navy. He felt this was desperately needed, and there was a comment in the British Journal about the U.S. Navy that never was there such a hopeless, broken down, tattered, forlorn apology for a navy, and this was largely true. During the Civil War, there were 700 ships in the U.S. Navy. Now it was down to 52 ships. They were all made of wood, all under sail power. Well, the rest of the world was sailing past this. They were building a modern navy built on steel ships, steam power. Chester Arthur thought the U.S. had to invest in this area. He brought in a Secretary of the Navy by the name of William Chandler, who aggressively lobbied Congress on his behalf. Congress finally agreed. 4 new ships. There would be 3 cruisers, 1 dispatch vessel, all made of steel. They called them the Atlanta, the Boston, the Chicago, and the Dolphin, the so-called ABCD ships. And while those were being built, Chandler continued his modernization. He established the Naval War College, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and he moved to eliminate political patronage and assessments from the shipyards. Now, more growth would follow in the U.S. Navy in successive presidencies as the U.S. Navy really began its push to modernization. But there's no question the pivot to the modern U.S. Navy, it began under the watchful eyes of President Chester Arthur and the advocacy of his Secretary of the Navy, William Chandler. Now, William Arthur, Chester Arthur's father, would clearly have been proud to have seen his son as President of the United States, but he would have been disappointed in one critical area. William Arthur was a fiery abolitionist preacher, and he would have been disappointed in Chester Arthur's record on the civil rights of blacks because virtually no progress was made in this area. In one case, Arthur did recommend funding support for black education in one of his annual messages, this being a priority of James Garfield, his predecessor, but nothing really ever came from that. Moreover, real setbacks during the Arthur administration in civil rights came in the courts. A ruling in 1883 that the 14th Amendment only applied to the federal government and state governments, but not to individual citizens or individual businesses. According to the Supreme Court and Justice Joseph Bradley, writing for the court, that Individual invasion of individual rights is not the subject matter of the amendment. So what did this mean? Well, much of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was ruled unconstitutional. It further opened the door for blatant discrimination in the South by individuals and businesses against blacks. Now, President Arthur was taken aback by this personally, and he encouraged Congress in one of his messages to do something about it. He said to Congress, the special purpose of this, the 14th Amendment, was to ensure to members of the colored race that the full enjoyment of civil and political rights. Any legislation whereby Congress may lawfully supplement the guarantees which the Constitution affords for the equal enjoyment by all citizens of the United States of every right, privilege, and immunity of citizenship will receive my unhesitating approval, but Congress took no action. The depredations against Southern blacks would continue unabated. Civil rights advocate Frederick Douglass said of the Arthur administration, there is nothing in his career as President of the United States that proves him to have had any sympathy with the oppressed colored people of the South. This is clearly one area that his abolitionist preacher father, William Arthur, would sorely have been disappointed in the outcomes of his son's presidency. There was one final act under the presidency of Chester Arthur, and it was to establish the civil government in Alaska. Alaska had been actually under military rule since it had been acquired from Russia about a decade and a half before. Arthur said that was time to end. Let's put a civil government in place. Congress complied with the Organic Act of 1884, and a civil government was finally established for Alaska. Now, outside of civil service reform, Chester Arthur basically meandered through his presidency. He advocated for several topics, made some progress in some areas, not a lot in most, which was frankly okay by him. He hated the policy side of things of being president. He enjoyed the social, he enjoyed the travel, but now he still had some decisions to make, including a pretty important one. Was he going to run again for President of the United States? We'll cover that story in another day. That is Chester Arthur and anything but the work from the life of Chester Arthur. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.